Paul was not merely a preacher, he was a Roman, and that single fact, often relegated to a footnote in theology, was instrumental in the strategic expansion of Christianity across the Mediterranean. While scholars debate the theological genius of Paul's epistles or the passion of his missionary zeal, few focus on the structural enabler that allowed him to carry the gospel across cities, regions, and hostile terrains with remarkable mobility and resilience: Roman citizenship. In the first century, Roman citizenship was not a symbolic privilege. It was a shield, legal, political, and cultural. It was a portable status that came with rights others did not enjoy: exemption from degrading punishments, the right to appeal to Caesar, freedom of movement within the empire, and a presumption of dignity before the law. In the imperial order that defined the known world, Paul's citizenship functioned as his passport, granting him the ability to preach not just with conviction but with legal authority. His missionary journeys, iconic as they are, were not simply spiritual expeditions. They were geopolitical movements facilitated by Roman infrastructure, protected by Roman law, and legitimized by Roman identity. When Paul stood in front of Roman governors, centurions, or even hostile crowds, he was not a foreigner to the empire. He was a man of the system, invoking the power of the very state whose roads he traveled. The first significant clue to Paul's dual identity appears in Acts 22, where, after being arrested in Jerusalem, he is about to be flogged. But then he utters the decisive words, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned?" Acts 22:25. The centurion steps back. Panic spreads among the Roman officials. Paul's status rewrites the rules of engagement in an instant. What was previously seen as a common disturbance now becomes a legal emergency. Paul is no longer a mere religious agitator. He is a Roman asserting his rights under the empire's legal framework. This moment is not incidental. It reveals the underlying architecture that made Paul's mission resilient. Without citizenship, his journey might have ended in a dark cell or with a whip's lash. With it, he appeals to Caesar himself. He buys time. He chooses his trials. He travels under imperial protection. But Paul's use of his citizenship was not just defensive, it was strategic. He knew the language of the empire, Latin in its legal sense, Greek in its cultural reach. He adapted his message for Jewish synagogues and Gentile audiences alike. He cited Greek poets. He spoke before philosophers in Athens and governors in Caesarea. Paul was not a rebel yelling from the margins. He was a diplomat of the divine, moving through the arteries of Roman power with the passport of Rome and the message of Christ. The roads that carried him were built by Roman ambition, paved for legions but repurposed by providence. The ships that ferried him across the Aegean and Mediterranean were not missionary fleets. They were commercial and military vessels of empire, and Paul used them not as a colonizer, but as a catalyst of spiritual subversion. This is the hidden infrastructure of evangelism: legal, cultural, and logistical. Paul's letters crisscrossed provinces, his reputation preceded him, and his citizenship granted him credibility in courts where others were silenced. It wasn't merely about faith, it was about access. His Roman name, Paulus, gave him entry into places that might have been closed to a man known only as Saul of Tarsus. Rome, ironically, became the cradle of Christianity, not because it embraced the gospel, but because it could not easily expel a citizen who carried it. Paul did not overthrow the empire. He navigated it. He used its own laws to inject it with a message it could not quarantine. By the time Paul reached Rome as a prisoner, he was also a guest of the state, housed under guard, but granted freedom to receive visitors and preach. The empire held him in chains, but its legal system had already become a megaphone. This dynamic challenges our modern categories. We often separate spiritual work from political realities. But Paul lived in a world where legal identity and religious mission were inseparable. His citizenship was not a matter of comfort, it was a weapon of access. He did not boast of it for pride, but deployed it when the message was threatened. Citizenship for Paul was not the goal. It was the vehicle. Moreover, Paul's experience illuminates the paradox of early Christianity, a faith born from a Jewish Messiah crucified by Roman authority, but spread by a Jewish Roman citizen who used Roman systems to preach a message of divine kingship. There is irony here, but also brilliance. Paul could speak to both Jews and Gentiles, both slaves and governors, because he lived at the intersection of worlds. His letters are full of this duality, fluent in Jewish law, yet immersed in Greco-Roman thought. When he writes to the Philippians about citizenship in heaven, he is not discarding his Roman status, he is reframing it. Just as Roman citizenship gave rights and identity on earth, heavenly citizenship reorients believers toward a higher allegiance. The metaphor only works because the audience knew what citizenship meant. It was not abstract, it was deeply practical, and so was the gospel. Paul's legacy, then, is not only theological, it is geopolitical. He showed that empires can be used against themselves, that roads built for conquest can become highways for truth, that courts designed to maintain power can become stages for eternal testimony. Paul's use of Roman citizenship was not accidental, it was providential. God chose a man who could move through the empire not as a fugitive, but as a citizen. This invites reflection on how faith interacts with structures of power. Paul's story reminds us that the expansion of truth often relies not only on conviction, but on position. Access matters. Status matters. Not as ends in themselves, but as tools for mission. The Roman passport was never neutral. It carried the weight of empire. But in Paul's hands, it carried something greater. Christianity did not spread in a vacuum. It spread through ships, letters, roads, languages, and laws. And central to all of it was a man who bore the name of Rome while proclaiming the name above every name. His citizenship was not his identity, but it was his instrument. And so, the gospel moved, not around the empire, but through it. Not despite its systems, but through their very arteries. Because Paul, the Roman citizen, understood what many overlook, that sometimes the most powerful message travels best in the language of the world it aims to redeem.